The session will be moderated by Mr. Takehiko Nakao, Chairman of the Institute Mizuho Research and Technologies Limited, and the former President of the Asian Development Bank. Mr. Nakao, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very important session to discuss concrete issues of the development, which is also regarding G7 because it's global issues. So today we have a very distinguished panelist which have expertise in different areas, and Bambang Brojonegoro, who was the Indonesian finance minister, who I met several times as ADB president, and today he will discuss maybe more macroeconomic issues or broad issues. And Miss Abula Abdel Latif, who is from Egypt, but she's also the very important person to discuss global governance. And today she discussed more about poverty and other remaining issues. And Miss Deepali Khanna, from Rockefeller Foundation, and you are originally from India. And she's the expert of climate issues, and she may talk about how to finance mitigation, adaptation, other issues. And then Mr. Dil Rahut, he's now at the ADBI, but originally from Bhutan, and he was also in the government of Bhutan. And he'll discuss food security, food issues, because he's an expert of food or agriculture. And then finally, Mr. John Barnett, who is also at the ADBI today, but he's from Ireland, and he used to work for European Central Bank also. So this is a very good combination of panelists, and I'm afraid that we can discuss in detail all these issues because we have a limited time, but I hope that we can quickly discuss important issues more straightforwardly. So I would like to ask from this side each person's view about their interest. So Abula-san, so you will talk about more about poverty and remaining issues, and also how to achieve those poverty reductions from the perspective of collaboration with G7. By the way, I forgot to mention this, but these all areas were covered by the ADB's publications of G2020, which is Asia's Journey to Prosperity. The 15 chapters including government, state versus market, industrial transformation, agriculture, climate change, and also the agenda issues, and poverty and income gap, and also regional cooperations and the financing. So I really ask you to, this is kind of a public relations, commercial advertisement of ADB work, but this is very thick book with a lot of data. For instance, it includes a gender chapter, which discusses about education, employment, and also the health of women. And one of the things which I remember clearly is in Bangladesh in 1960, which was a part of Pakistan, East Pakistan, the women's average years of education was just 0.2 years. Most of women didn't have any education, but today it is more like 9 years. So it made a difference to Bangladesh. The Bangladesh is now very prosperous in developing textile garment industry, but it is based on this kind of education. And women's schooling years in Bangladesh and many other countries are longer than that of men today. So that is making difference. So I really ask you to look at this Asian Journey to Prosperity, and including a technology part, and which is discussing against the idea that Asia's growth is more by labor and capital alone, like a Krugman. So I really ask you to look at it, and it is on the homepage of ADB. So first, again, Abra-san, please mention what you want to say.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dean Sonabe, for inviting me to be part of this, of the T7. And thank you, sir. And it was a pleasure working with all my colleagues here. And let me start by saying that, since you started with gender, let me start by saying that women are very important in the world. In case guys do not remember that, we can make a lot of difference. It's important. All right, about poverty and inequality issues, it's an issue that cannot possibly be overemphasized in importance. But what is very clear about it also is that the rhetoric is very strong, the talk is very strong about the importance of eradicating poverty and inequality and all this, but the actions on the ground are actually very limited. Okay, there are efforts, but then it's like water, water everywhere, but not a single drop to drink. Okay, you hardly see it. Actually, the SDG targets of 2030 seem to be going in the opposite direction. As a matter of fact, things have been worse in the last few years, and if the trend continues, it's going to be completely different from what is targeted. This means right away that things are not happening with the right approach or with the correct way of doing things. And what I want to do during my few points is talk about why it's not going in the right direction and what can be done about it and what G7 can be asked to do. And I'll go surf through all this very quickly. Point number one, when we talk about poverty or when we talk about debt or when we talk about limited investments, climate compliance issues, none of these is a separate issue. All of these are connected with each other. Okay? It's a vicious circle of poor performance and poverty, and you cannot possibly get rid of poverty if you are still stuck with the debt, et cetera, et cetera. So the interconnectedness is important to remember. That's number one. Number two, the tool that has been used the most in the world to deal with poverty has been financial aid. Okay? And financial aid is nice, it helps, but it is temporary. The effect is temporary, it doesn't reach everybody, and it's definitely not sustainable. This is not what would achieve the inclusive growth that we are dreaming of, okay? So this is the second point. The third point, to really reach the inclusive growth, we need to grow out of the problem, grow out of poverty. And grow out of poverty means a bunch of things, and these were actually covered by the task force papers that we looked at. Okay, one of them, you need to target the poor properly. You need to have enough information and target the poor because their needs are different. Okay, we need to improve access to finance, introduce innovative means for finance that help particularly women, young people in rural areas, introduce small banks, encourage micro finance, social enterprises. We need to improve the access to jobs by improving the skills, developing the skills, improving the digital infrastructure, by worrying very much about the child care, which was actually mentioned by the beautiful Indian lady at the beginning in the presentations. Interestingly enough, and there is a very interesting number here, from 2000 to 2021, only $2 billion were spent on child care projects by 8 different organizations, when the World Bank spent $2 billion on projects related to oil and gas in 2021 alone. Okay, so this actually says the whole thing. The next point is, instead of dealing or along with dealing with the symptoms of the problems, we need to look at the core of the problems. And the core of the problems lie in governments of the countries in the South that are not institutionally capable, have very limited capabilities. Countries from the North adopting policies that are suitable for them, even if they involve exploiting actually developing countries, and also bad handling by the North in the natural disasters that happened in the last few years, whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about the climate situation. And all this calls right away for what G7 can do and hopefully will do. Okay? One, they need to support the efforts of the countries that try to grow out of poverty. Very important. The governments from the South that seek to grow out of poverty, they need to support them. They need to be the forum that supports all kinds of attempts of this kind. They need to adopt and finance programs, okay, that can take in that direction, especially the ones that are related to women, youth, and rural areas. This is where poverty is concentrated. But the most important thing that is needed was actually mentioned last session very eloquently by Ambassador Shinoy when he was actually talking about the multilateral system and the change, because all the problems are emerging because the South does not have any voice in this setting. It is not there. It's not visible. Even when consulted with, it's consulted with on the sides, never in the main issue. And even in handling of the Ukraine problem and the war, as unfortunate as things are, it's looked at and it's being handled as a unique special case, when actually it's not a unique and special case. There are also other cases. The multilateral system is proving to be very weak and needs change. It's like a small box where you're trying to fit an elephant, the elephant being the problems that we are seeing today. So as a person from the South, I'm calling and hoping that Japan in particular, I'm not going to say G7, because the interest is not there by structure, but Japan, okay, with the values and the special status of Japan in Asia, would support this, and T20 would do something similar, at least initiate the talk about changing the system, and perhaps adding members to the G20 representation from Africa, for instance, and from Latin America. It can be initiated. I think it's very important. I think it will make a big difference, because without having the South properly represented with their voice high enough, we will never get rid of poverty or the other problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very comprehensive point and interesting point in the end. So, Bamban, so it's your time, and many countries were affected by the pandemic, and also they are now facing, as Sri Mulyani minister said, there is issues of raising interest rate by developed countries. So there can be some effect on the Indonesia and other emerging countries. But I feel that they are much stronger than before, like Asian financial crisis. But how do you see the situation in emerging economies? Once Sri Mulyani, Dr. Mulyani said to me that there is no luxury for a country like Indonesia to follow the course like America or Japan, because once they pursue loose economic policies, it is attacked by the exchange rate volatilities and outflow of capital. So I feel that the emerging economies are now stronger, especially in Asia. But how do you see the situation in Asia?
Yeah. Clearly, after COVID, of course, we expect the recovery will be smooth and we can go back to the economic condition prior to 2020. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Number one, of course, because there is a supply side disruption that finally triggers the high inflation. And of course, high inflation already there for many times in many countries. But the high inflation this time is quite awkward, is quite strange, because it happens in developed economy that usually doesn't have experience of high inflation. It happens in US, it happens in Western Europe, including UK. It happens as well in Japan. At least, usually Japan doesn't have issue with inflation. Sometimes Japan is struggling to get some kind of inflation, but then suddenly Japan has, I think, 5 or 6% inflation, which is relatively high. And of course, it also affects other parts of the world. So with the case of high inflation in developed country, then of course, for country like US, there is no other way to maintain the pressure of inflation other than increasing interest rate. It's very unfortunate that finally Federal Reserve has to increase interest rate very aggressively. Of course, increasing interest rate has been happening for many times. But this time around, the rate of increase is very aggressive. And if we look at the latest data, even though the inflation pressure in US, for example, has been moderating as well as in Western Europe, but it's not yet at the level that they might feel comfortable. You know, I mean, for example, in US, it's still 5%, which is lower than the previous months or previous quarter, but 5% is still relatively high for US standard. And of course, the impact of the high interest rate for Federal Reserve, and it happens with the US dollar, then it will impact, of course, major developing economy. Many developing economies will receive the impact. And certainly, as Nakao-san mentioned, Indonesia doesn't have luxury, to do a lot of monetary policy, except then watching what happened with the high interest rate in the US. So of course, the Indonesian Central Bank has to increase the interest rate, and it might affect economic growth, but thankfully, at least there are several things that could help developing economy, at least to mitigate the potential impact of the high inflation rate or the potential slowing economic growth. Number one, of course, the relatively high commodity price. It really helps some or many developing economy, because then our export has been performing well, so the surplus from our export at least can somehow mitigate the pressure to our currency coming from of course, the strong US dollar. And number two, of course, the domestic market. Again, emerging market and developing economy is named like that because we are emerging due to the big big base of the consumption. We have big consumption base that basically save the economy, create local demand that absorb, of course, the production, and of course, making the economy growing. So at least the impact to economic growth has been moderated, and of course, there is a weakening of our currency, but the weakening of the currency, at least compared to what Nakao-san mentioned, the Asian financial crisis 1998, is very much mild. I mean, yes, rupiah, for example, and maybe some other currencies in Asia have been weakening, but the weakening rate is much less compared to what happened in 1998. So basically, we are still okay, but of course, we still expect more or a smooth recovery from COVID. And unfortunately, has not happened yet because of the supply side disruption happening in the advanced economy.
Thank you very much. So your point that the consumption is a very important part of demand in emerging economies is important, because often it is too much emphasized that Asian emerging economies are export-oriented. But the most important demand is, of course, domestic consumption. But Indonesia is lucky because it is resource-rich countries. So resource shortage countries is more suffering. But anyway, very nice discussion. So, Deepali-san, it's about climate change, and there are so many discussions about the risk, concerns about the climate change, but the concrete, steps is not going smoothly because of the energy demand by many countries and so on. So, how do you look at it, and how can we make a progress, including financing side?
Thank you so much. And before I start, I want to thank Dean Sanabe for this invitation. And obviously, it's really a privilege for me to be part of this panel. Before I answer the question, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about looking at the fundamental issues that are ahead of us. So even though every country is facing the mix of compounding issues, the impact on each of the countries is quite different. And the ability of each country to be able to deal with this challenge, let alone be able to overcome it, is kind of very, very different. Clean infrastructure and climate finance are foundational to sustainable economic development and shared prosperity. Leveraging of public finance to unlock private capital may have become a cliche, but the timing for a renewed focus on a global South-led agenda is ripe. Now let's look at the evidence in front of us. Just recently, we at the Rockefeller Foundation, in partnership with BCG, conducted a study and found that only 16% of the climate finance needs are being met. Just 16%. And emerging technologies and markets are experiencing the most severe financing gaps. Critical decarbonization levers such as carbon capture and sequestration and fuel cell technology are not even receiving a bare minimum 5% of what their needs are. So it's really putting hard-to-abate sectors at very high risk. Likewise, higher project and sovereign risks in developing economies have resulted in serious climate mitigation and adaptation funding gaps. Wealthier countries, we know, have neglected to meet their commitments. They'd made a pledge that they would be contributing 0.7% of their GDP towards foreign aid. Has that happened? No. They also said they'd be mobilizing over $100 billion annually. Did that happen? No. And the World Bank and IMF have struggled to tailor their instruments to support countries in the moment of profound need. A few weeks ago, we all saw finance ministers, central bank governors, activists in DC attending the spring meetings. And what really struck me was the statement made by the Barbados Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, who said that global financial architecture was never designed for global South nations. And I think we've been hearing that since morning. So what can be done by G7? The most important policy areas for both G20 and G7 ought to be the same. We can't afford to have one policy imperative for the G20 and another one for the G7. And I really want to highlight 3 important points. The first one is supporting a global South-led agenda for redesigning the global financial architecture. Absolutely critical. Second is reforming and modernizing multilateral development banks. And the third one is confronting debt vulnerabilities in developing countries. I'll delve a little bit deeper into each one of them, because again, like Abla, my shout out when I'm saying G7 is really to Japan, because we do really feel that your leadership in the G7 is going to be so critical. So in evolving the global financial architecture, the G7 should reinforce the swift momentum for creation of a World Bank evolution roadmap accelerated by the India G20 presidency, especially in the backdrop of what we're seeing right now around the transition towards a new leadership to advance a truly transformative change for global South-led new global financial architecture. Japan's G7 presidency should extend its support to G20 India to accelerate a global South-led version of the Bridgetown Initiative, echoing the climate finance and economic recovery needs, and voices of emerging economies that will offer a range of policy imperatives for reformation and strengthening of MDBs. We really need to be unlocking additional dollars for key priorities such as energy transition, access, also enabling the creation of more green jobs in developing economies. On the MDB reform side, thanks to the work of the G20 appointed independent commission, it is clear that multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, could use its balance sheets for much more aggressively putting more additional dollars into the system for climate finance. And G7 should work together with G20 for creating a roadmap for the full adoption of the capital adequacy framework recommendations, such as the use of callable capital, expanded use of proven financial innovations, and many others. Through these interventions, the MDBs can increase the amount of capital that is going to go to the developing economies where it's really needed. And the focus should also be on attracting and leveraging private capital investment in vulnerable and struggling countries. On debt sustainability, a key step by G7 should be fixing the G20 common framework for debt treatments, which is the mechanism for restructuring and reducing debt burdens, in part by including firm deadlines on the restructuring. During COVID, the G20's debt service suspension initiative did put a pause both on principal and interest payments, so we should be looking at something similar. Taken together, all these sorts of changes can give states drowning in debt a lifeline and encourage the sort of investments that are really needed in the 21st century. Similarly, G7 could do more to help liquidity crunches from becoming debt crises by channelizing. We know that the unused IMF special drawing rights, so these can be effectively augmented towards member countries for official reserves to really help countries at risk be able to address their liquidity now. The fund could also raise access limits to its rapid financing facilities and temporarily suspend interest rate surcharges, which are really becoming a significant issue. I know what I've stated seems like a lot, but I think the time to act is ready now. We can't afford to lose any more time. At the recently concluded spring meetings of the World Bank and IMF, the World Bank shifted towards adopting climate change as a guiding part of the mission and made some adjustments to free up $50 billion in additional lending over the next decade. My plea to G7 Japan would be to leverage this momentum to really keep the wheel rolling and use the upcoming Paris Summit in June and the World Bank IMF annual meetings in October just to keep the momentum going. Lastly, we must keep in mind, and all of us have been saying that all of this cannot be achieved optimally without cooperation between G20 and G7 countries. In fact, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Asia Development Bank Institute, in an unprecedented format, recently convened a group of experts, both from T7 and T20, along with representation from G7 Japan and G20 India at our Bellagio Center, to really discuss where these areas of convergence could be, and most importantly, pathways to foster more cooperation. I think trust has been broken down, so we really will need to be investing a lot more in relationships so that the trust factor goes up.
Okay, so can you wrap up?
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. So basically what I really want to say is, in conclusion, is that what happens during G7's presidency by Japan and India's G20 presidency will signal to the world willingness or lack thereof to address today's crisis with a focus on long-term gains rather than short-term paybacks about which we're hearing a lot. So it's really important that the right agenda is set, and I'm pretty confident that the broken current system can be restored and revitalized. I'm optimistic, and I really have a lot of confidence both in the Japan presidency and the India presidency to really be able to bring about transformational change in vulnerable communities who Abla spoke about, who every day are feeling the crisis of the climate change knocking at their door.
Thank you very much, Deepali-san. So let's go to Dil, and who is once again expert of food securities and issues. So in 1950s, around 1960s, the most important issue for Asia was a growing population, how to avoid the starvations of those peoples, and Green Revolution, in a sense, solved part of the issue. But we are now facing another kind of challenge of food. So can you mention these issues?
Thank you, Nakao-san. Yeah, firstly, thank you, everyone. And I'd like to share my feeling about T7 summit. I'm from Bhutan, and I would like to say that it's very inclusive. Being a Bhutanese, I'm here and able to share my thoughts on food security issues. So I'd like to say that it's very, very inclusive, unlike other T7 that was held in the past. It was in Germany last year. So with that, I'd like to give a brief background about food security. If you look at global food productions between 1961 and today, 2021, we have made a very great progress. If you look at cereal productions in 1961 was about 850 million tons. Today, we are producing almost 3,000 million tons. Such a great achievement, not only on cereal productions, but also on the productions of other commodities like oil, fruits, vegetables. We have made a significant progress. And most of this increase in productions has come from increase in productivity, not increase in the land size, because we didn't have that options. The land holding per capita is only about 0.1779 per capita land holding. So it's very, very small. So, and the other thing that we should note is that most of this increase has come from Asia. Today, if you look at cereal productions, more than 50% of cereal productions globally is coming from Asia. So Asia has played a very important role in global food security. However, we should know that this food security has not come just like that. It has come with a cost. We have damaged the environment. Lots of damage has been done. So we really need to undo what we have already damaged. That's one. And although we have made so much of progress, but we are still not yet out of the wood, I would say. Today, in 2021, almost 2.3 billion people are severely or moderately hungry. Just imagine 2.3 billion. And 3.1 billion people cannot afford healthy meal. And almost 767 million people are undernourished. I don't want to mention about vitamin deficiencies, iron deficiencies, overweight, obesity problems. So we are, despite so much progress, we still have much to do. There's a lot of things that we need to do. And the other challenge is that if you look at the global population, between 1961 to today, 1961 it was about 3.3 million. Today we are close to about 3.3 billion. Today we are about close to about 8 billion. By 2050 we are going to touch almost 9.7 billion. So the challenge is how to feed 9.7 billion people. And that too, we are constrained by few rising problems. One of the most crucial problems is the problem of the climate change. Climate change is going to decrease the food productions globally. And second thing is the environment. We have already damaged our environment. The land degradation is so heavy, you cannot imagine. Almost 25% of the land is degraded. If we don't do anything by 2050, 95% of our earth will be degraded. Water stress. Today, we are under heavy water stress. If we look at the number of people living in a water stress zone today, it's humongous. And by 2050, it's going to increase. And 72% of the water is taken by agriculture. So just imagine where we are. And on top of that, we have conflicts. We have situations like COVID pandemics. So how do we move forward? So one of the important things that I'd like to urge G7 is to make a continuous investment on R&D, not like, if you look at G7, they have taken lots of initiative, but these are ad hoc, and these are reactive, and not a very continuous one. We have seen in several investments they have done. So I would like to urge T7 to make a continuous investment, not only to improve the productions, but also to maintain it, sustain the productions. That's one. And second thing is that I would like to call for partnership, global partnership between G7, G20, and other partners. Today, until now, G7 countries has been the beneficiaries of the investment that has happened in R&D, particularly from CGI centers. We would also like G20 has really grown, and I would also like to urge G20 to collaborate with G7 and make investments so that we have the data, the technology, the knowledge, know-how available not only to G20 but beyond G20 countries. So that's another thing that I'd like to call for. The other thing, what Chris Barrett calls is like, developing and scaling bundled socio-technological innovations for healthy, equitable, resilient, and sustainable food per capita with minimal impact on the environment. So I'd like to urge T7 to invest on developing those technology and scaling up. And the fourth, that's very important, if you look at today, 500 million farmers are smallholder farmers who depend on less than 2 hectares of land. And these are the people who contribute to about 80% of the global food security. And I would like to strongly urge T7 to invest on climate change adaptations and mitigations, particularly for these smallholder farmers, because they are poor and they cannot adapt to climate change on their own. And when we are waiting for net zero carbon emissions to happen, we really need to ensure that these farmers are adaptable. Not only it will help in food security, but also it will help in reducing poverty, because most of the poverty is concentrated among these smallholder farmers. With that, I would like to end.
Okay, thank you very much. Very concrete. So, John, it's your turn, and there are many issues regarding debt again after the pandemic, and also after several other issues, including supply chains and so on. So, how do you see the debt issues at this moment?
Thank you very much, Nakao-san. So, let me provide some remarks across 4 key points. So, firstly, I'd like to talk about the context for the debt issue and the debt crisis that we face today. Then I will talk about the common framework that's in place to restructure that debt and the problems that is faced in that regard. I'll talk about 2 other issues around areas where the G7 can provide some possible solutions, and then some final remarks on the way forward. So first of all, the context. I think everybody's well aware that This debt issue for developing economies has been around for quite some time. Before the pandemic, of course, accommodative monetary policy and loose global financial conditions, of course, stimulated rising debt levels. Now, changing interest rate growth differentials in the period since the pandemic has, of course, amplified some of the debt distress risks that we see today. Of course, last year, with global financial conditions tightening, this further amplified the debt distress risks that we see. And we're currently at a situation whereby 60% of low-income countries globally are either already in debt distress or at serious risks in that regard. Now, the question is, what can be done? So, as we know, as I'm sure are all aware, the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment is in place. However, there are serious shortcomings with that framework. And let me just discuss a couple of those and what the G7 could possibly do to essentially resurrect the effectiveness of that framework. So one of the issues around the creditor composition over the past 20 years is that it has shifted from the Paris Club members towards more private creditors as well as China. And of course, while the diversification in the creditor base can be an important factor in, raising finance, it can create problems when one is trying to resolve debt issues. And this is one of the problems with the framework. Firstly, as Deepali already has said, there are problems regarding the timescale and lack of comparability of treatment as a result of that. But as well as that, there needs to be a real, not only incentive, but a real need to drive participation of the private sector in the resolution process. And that's currently missing at the moment. And given that the creditor base has expanded substantially towards private creditors, without involving private creditors in the resolution or the restructuring, it will essentially be a futile exercise. And regulation is needed in this regard, and something that this is an area where the G7 can provide a strong role, I think. Other issues include, for example, SDRs. So there's a commitment by the G20 members to pledge $100 billion towards poor and vulnerable countries, and this could be put to use for fiscal, capacities, and to address some of the debt problems that are faced at the moment. However, currently only 60 billion has been pledged to date, while none has been actually dispersed. So I think greater efforts are needed there, as well as some operational obstacles related to the transfer of SDRs need to be addressed as well, and that's something that the G7 could look at. Another issue that's important to note is that a large portion of the debt by developing economies is held in foreign currency, and what we have seen, particularly US dollar, and what we have seen last year with the sharp appreciation of the dollar is that this can pose serious constraints on these economies in terms of the sustainability of that debt. Of course, the appreciation of the dollar leads to an increase in the domestic value of that debt, and it can push these economies, therefore, into an unsustainable situation. So I think the G7 has an important role to play there in, factoring in hedging into debt restructuring, for example, and monitoring the overall exposure of these economies to, for example, changes in global exchange rates, particularly relative to the US. There are some other issues around incorporating climate risks in debt sustainability analyses. This has been progressing very well over the past few years, I think, but certainly there is more to be done in that regard. And finally, I would say that, as well as pushing towards helping with financial resources, it's also important for the G7 to improve the capacities of developing economies with regard to public debt management. So I think technological transfer in this regard and building capacity on public public debt management is an important factor to bear in mind as well.
Thank you very much. We have covered so many issues in a very concrete ways and interesting way. So I'd like to make a second round, and starting from Abra-san. So you mentioned that global governance should be reformed, and that is one of the very important base for tackling the issues in developing countries. But if we look at the Asian countries, for instance, many countries got support from the World Bank, IMF, not so much IMF because there were not so many financial crises, but also the ADB and others. But at the same time, many Asian countries could develop more or less by themselves. And it was not about the time that the MDBs or the global governance was so much, voiced by the developing countries. So how do you see the Asian success, or how do you rate the issues of governance with those regional differences?
Thank you for the question, and it's a very interesting one and a very broad one. Okay. Okay, let me compare a little bit Asia to the Africa situation, okay, if I may. And let me put it in a bit of a more general way. Why is Asia doing better? Okay. Governance, of course, is an important issue, but there is a lot more to it than that. Let's put it this way. The development of Asia happened at a time when they had a chance to benefit from globalization. They based their development on export promotion at a time when the world was open for export promotion, literally. Okay, so there is an issue of time here. You started earlier, okay, which we did not have. Okay, not to discredit any local efforts at doing well and so on, but the circumstances allowed and made it easier. Africa, on the other hand, and one has to be careful here to distinguish, which I hate to do, but I will have to do here, between North Africa, South Africa, and the rest of Africa. But if we look at the heart of Africa, okay, you are going to find that it's in a completely different situation. It's exploited, it is trapped in the vicious circle of poverty that I was talking about, and it's not allowed to get out of it. It is not allowed to get out.
Even after independence,
even after independence,
it continued to be exploited.
Let me give you an example. Africa at this point is contributing no more than 3% to the climate damage, okay? And yet it's paying a very heavy price, and nobody's trying to make any compensation for what they're having. It's worse than that. They are asked to export their oil and natural gas and not use it for industrialization, and go for industrialization in a green way when everybody knows that you need the fossil fuel for industrialization. And it's going to take a long while before hydrogen becomes suitable for supporting industrialization. So it's not allowed to get out of it. It is stuck there. Okay, one last point, just to give you the example of how bad the situation is in Africa. I'll give an example from Sudan. Sudan is a very, very interesting country, and like 10 years ago, I was there to help them with some strategy for development. They have 4 million heads of cows, and they don't drink fresh milk. They import powder milk to feed their kids. So it tells you a lot. They don't have meat industry, they don't have a milk industry. So these countries are very far, but the world is not helping them for sure. It's the vicious circle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very interesting or very insightful comment about Africa. So, Bamba-san, again, about your comment of macroeconomic conditions, the very important achievement can be damaged by this kind of volatility. But I think many countries, Indonesia, are doing well. But my question is about how do you see this deglobalizations? And as Abra-san mentioned, one of the basic foundations of the growth in Asia was relative peace, and also the globalization's trend from 1950s to 2000 or 2010. So, but now there is a kind of a conflict between the West and China and others, and a lot of the pandemic and supply chain disruptions. So, how do you see? Do you think that the globalization will be prevented, and it will become more I mean, separated kind of economy, or how do you see the situation and the impact of it to your country, for instance?
Okay. Yeah. Of course, globalization is there, and we cannot avoid the globalization. And in fact, compared to 70s or 80s, when we experienced globalization mostly in trade, for movement of goods and services, now we are witnessing the globalization of both the finance. Now financial globalization is a trend. Plus, we cannot forget the globalization of technology, especially digital technology. So that's the kind of globalization that we have to face right now. And what will be the impact? Let me continue our previous discussion with Nakao-san, when Nakao-san mentioned that the Asian countries or any developing countries without resources will suffer because of the, let's say, high interest rate. I would say that they will find a way. Of course, they cannot rely on the resources, but the so-called Asian miracle that happens in Japan and Korea can take place not because of the commodities, but because of the human resources and competitiveness in manufacturing. And now, even Indonesia already experienced that in 1990s when our major export products are not coal or palm oil, but instead at that time, the major our exporting products are textile, garments, electronics, footwear. And now, those kind of pattern have been replicating. For example, I would like to take two kind of successful countries that now experiencing the big export in those labor-intensive type of products, Bangladesh and Vietnam. I think Bangladesh and Vietnam have been very successful, becoming not only the producer, but also the exporters of textile, garments, as well as electronics and footwear. And now with the financial globalization and digital globalization, I believe Asian countries and many emerging market and developing economies will take the benefit. How can we take the benefit? Let's get the example China. China, of course, now has maybe a tension with the US, but China can do their own survival. Initially, trying to do it with the labor-intensive type of manufacturing, but lately, of course, they cannot depend on those kind of products, but they are now moving into the technology export. They are exporting basically the digital, not only software, but also hardware. The name like Huawei, like ZTE, for example, now become the common name in the telecommunication industry. Even they are very much competitive with similar products coming from the Western world. And when we look at our cell phone, for example, yes, there are cell phones, of course, iPhone, very popular. But for example, if you look at Indonesian market now, the biggest, the most popular cell phone, of course, consumed by the Indonesian are not iPhone or even Samsung. It's Xiaomi from China. It means that the globalization in terms of trade or goods and services might be disrupted because of many conflicts, maybe some kind of spirit of reducing multilateralism. But the globalization in financial sector and globalization in globalization in digital technology, I think is unavoidable. Nobody can stop this kind of globalization, especially on finance and digitalization. So that might be the solution for many emerging market and developing economies, rather than maybe trying to follow the old concept of just getting into manufacturing and being successful. Now maybe you have to move a little bit more difficult, going into both digital technology and financial sector in order to leverage yourself from middle income country into high-income country.
Thank you very much, Bamba-san. I must agree most of your points, but I'm also concerned about how geopolitical tension would prevent the smooth, expansions of globalization. I think globalization is our course, and we shouldn't, change it. But at the same time, there are many other concerns. But we should make a collaboration to keep it seriously. So thank you very much. And Deepalai-san, you mentioned a lot about MDB's reforms, but as a former president of ADB, I think ADB made climate change the top priority, and also gender and remaining poverty. But climate change is the most important areas of MDBs at the ADB, and I think the World Bank is also doing it. And also the use of existing capital, and at ADB we merged the concessional loans to the ordinary loans, and we use more leverage based on the same capital. So we are making, MDBs are making efforts of doing that, but you still believe it is a very, lacking important point. So what can we do? And also SDR, this is also mentioned by John, but SDR, special drawing right, is not magic money, but it is a kind of credit line, and if they use it, they must pay interest. So what do you think is the most important change? The rating issues, or what is that?
So, of course, the MDBs are trying, and World Bank, ADB, as you said, they're all becoming climate banks now. But, but just by saying that they're going to become a climate bank, what is it that they're going to do differently, right? Is an important question. And I know ADB, there is a lot of seriousness. They're going around first building up capacities within the bank by training all their staff to really understand what are the issues that we're talking about when it comes to climate. I think one of the things we've learned as a foundation is the intersectionality of everything that we're trying to do. And as Dil was saying, food and climate, health and climate, power and climate. Everything is so intertwined, and we can't be looking at climate issues with a very, very narrow focus. So how do we first, ensure that the multilateral development banks understand what is really the need of the hour, where and how they should be investing, what are the kind of instruments and solutions and tools that are really going to work for the countries for which they're being designed. I think earlier on it was also said, how do you on the Indonesian side, how do you listen to people who are going to be, how are you interacting with the governments? Like, is ADB, World Bank spending enough time with the G20 countries, as well as the G77 countries and everybody else to really see what is it that they need, And I think that really is important. Also, at the pace at which things are happening, recently at the spring meeting, $50 billion were released by World Bank. Why did it take so long? By looking at their balance sheets, they've been able to also generate some new additional capital. Can there be more of an impetus on holding the MDBs more accountable? And at the end of the day, who's really going to hold them accountable? Where and how can the countries who really need to be front and center, do they have a voice? They don't necessarily have a voice. I feel there's a real urge and a need to kind of do things quicker and really push the accountability levels to a very different level. I guess on the SDR piece, there's the whole surcharge. It's complicated. If there was a silver bullet, we would have addressed it. But the point is, there's a lot of hope with the Japan presidency with G7 and on the Indian side, where again, you listen to the G20 Sherpa even this morning, there is that clear desire that, we need to be really ensuring that there's a huge gap on the climate finance side. How do we really ensure that the climate finance gets to the vulnerable communities as soon as possible? And what is it that the MDBs can do? How can we really create a new global financial architecture? How do we look at the debt issues, which are really putting countries in a very, very vulnerable situation?
Thank you very much. Very clear. So the next is Dil-san, and you mentioned so many interesting issues, and the key point is continued innovation or R&D investment. And there are many things in green revolution, like fertilizers and the pesticide, and also varieties. And when I visited Manila's IRI, Rice Institute, I saw the submarine rice, which could survive even underwater for some time. So there are many, developments, and also water usage or irrigation. Drip irrigation is one technology which can save the water. So there are many, and also logistics is very important, isn't it, to avoid the waste of food. So what do you think is the most important? Or all these things are important? How do you see it?
This is a million-dollar question in the sense that it's because food security is such an important issue, and if you fail to tackle from different angles, then it becomes very challenging to ensure food security. Of course, we have to continue with green revolutions, but when green revolution happened, I think it happened at a time when things were very, very dire. There was famine and there was an emergency. There was a need to act very quickly. And Norman Borlaug was the one who pioneered it, and he won the Nobel Prize, and he could save millions of lives. But then if I reflect on green revolutions today, because that time we didn't have time to think, but now we really need to look at what worked and what didn't work, what brought negative impact and what brought a positive impact, and try to remove those things that really actually were detrimental to the food security. So moving forward, because we are already more or less food secure, we are not in an emergency, so we could test the technology and changes that we bring in and then move slowly, because the problem of maladaptations, we don't know when we are actually adopting the technology. We think that it would bring benefit, but as we move forward, we realize that it's devastating. So
I see. And also the incentive to the farmers, as you mentioned, was important. And also many people eat more meat, so we need a more kind of products, agriculture product to feed those animals. So that is another issue. So John, you mentioned the debt sustainability or debt issues, but I have two questions. One is about China again. And if we look at Pakistan and Sri Lanka, I don't think they intend to entrap those developing countries, but they did give a loan very massively without really organizing and those loans and also the economic rationale of them, whether it is productive enough or not. And another question is, we have already had a lot of the issues like a millennium debt relief, and if the creditors ask to give a debt relief, they become more, prudent about giving new loans. So we cannot continue to use just a debt reduction, debt relief. And also you mentioned private sectors, and many private sectors are now bondholders. So they're having a lot of discussion about how to involve private sector involvement discussions in the IMF. So there are many issues. So it's not so simple to say that we should give a more, debt relief or approach to those countries, because it causes also another issues of, how prudent, less lending to those countries. So, and also China, whether they can be a part of the common framework, or they are not Paris Club member, but it's unexpected that such a country like China, big economy, still they are saying that it is developing countries, but it's not a part of OECD or Paris Club. So this is really big issue, because if the creditors, Paris Club creditors give debt relief to debt countries, if those money is used to repay to the China or to private sector, what is it for? So this is a very tricky issue today compared to maybe 30 years ago.
Thank you, Naka-san. Very interesting questions. I will try to answer them succinctly. So the first question was around, which I referred to in my first intervention, was around the change in the creditor composition over time. So it switched really from the Paris Club, if we look back over 20 years, more towards China and private creditors. And as I said, this can create some problems when it comes to debt restructuring, having more of a creditor base there, while it's also very useful for building up financing. But we're not in that situation now. But I think that, your question also relates to debt transparency concerns. So, with the shift away from the Paris Club towards private creditors, and other non-Paris Club members, there is some lack of debt transparency, so there's not a real understanding of the true level of the exposure. So that's something that the G7, for example, should push towards resurrecting. I'm talking about the OECD's framework on that. But the G7 could have a role to play in really making it not voluntary and forcing it through. So that would be important. Another point to make would be, we should not blame everything on the creditors. The debtors have a role to play as well in, ensuring that they make the best use of the funds that they receive and put the capital to productive use and put these funds to productive use. At the current juncture, it's perhaps not clear that developing economies have the capacities to allocate those funds in a productive manner over the longer term, and that's certainly something to be considered. So we shouldn't blame everything on the creditors, although there is a role to play that they perhaps are not, in all cases, making loans that are, in accordance with specific guidelines that would make them a little bit more safe. But on the other hand, the debtors certainly have a role to play to ensure that they have put the capital and put these loans to productive uses. But again, that requires some capacity building, which I referred to around building capacity on, for example, public debt management expertise, technology transfer. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have had a very good discussion, but I would like to ask the audience to ask questions, and I will ask, I would get two, three, 4 questions, and then I'll ask all of you to quickly answer to question you want to answer. Okay, so anyone, please with the, orange cloth. いや、このオレンジの奥の方にまず。
We're lining up. Jenny Gordon, Australian National University, and also on the ADBI Advisory Council, and I'm involved in Task Force 4, and there's lots of overlapping issues, and I just want to say what a great session that is and how I'm looking forward to reading the issues paper. My question goes to the issue around and thinking about growing out of poverty, and again, everything's related. And so ultimately, if you think about how you grow out of poverty, this idea that you generate sufficient scale, productivity gains within, trading within your own economy, some of that can happen, but most of it's going to need external capital. And if you need external capital, you need to repay it. So we still need that kind of export base. So given that we need that, how do you see the global trading system moving? How much will be digital that we could, digital services can be provided? Where are the opportunities going to be? And what do you see as really needing to lay the groundwork to be able to take advantage of those emerging opportunities? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the next question.
Good. Thank you. Good afternoon to all. My name is Shukwi. By country, I'm from Iran, and by practice, I'm agricultural expert in development of project. My question is that, rather more concern is that developmental issue, including the environmental conservation matter and poverty reduction, are very closely tied to the political issues. So when there is any political interruption between the countries, all developmental effort, including those related to SDGs, will be interrupted. There need to be a mechanism that separate or at least loosen the coupling of political issues and developmental issues, that people be sure, even there is a political interruption, the developmental issues go as usual and as planned. Can even the T7 or some other think tank maybe can act as a catalyzer and deal with this issue? Thank you. Sorry, I'm taking a long time, but I stop here.
Thank you. Is there any further question? Okay, so the man in the center, yeah, with the pink shirt.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is Shuan Satragazi from University of Tokyo Institute for Future Initiatives. And my question is for Mr. Rahut regarding sustainability in agriculture. Usually it takes a bit of lag time from the time farmers decide to go for more sustainable systems of agriculture until they see the results in terms of more profit. And this is the part where many farmers decide to discontinue sustainable practices. So what do you think can motivate or keep them in the sustainable practice until they see the actual results? What has worked in the cases that you have seen? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there was another hand, so the lady, and that is maybe the last, or is there any additional question? So that is 5 altogether. So please go ahead.
Thank you. My name
Please
is,
stand up. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. My name is Maria Kuroshima. I'm a senior researcher at Keio Research Institute at the SFC. I had worked for public sector for past 5 years. My question is related to the relations between geopolitics issues and the economics issue. I totally agree with the opinion that private and public investment are one of the key to support the economic growth of global South countries. But I've heard the increasing geopolitical tension could decrease FDI of each countries and increase their living cost and interest rate expense to fight inflation. And those impact must be huge on emerging country and developing countries, I'm afraid. To support the economic growth and enhance the private investment, I think mitigating geopolitical risk is the most important. But this is a cross-cutting issue between economics and national security and difficult to analyze easily, I think. And IMF suggests that the concern, but they could not show the policy recommendation related to national security. So can G7 and G20 related think tanks tackle with this issue to propose by the academic or research aspect? Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you. So the last questions by...
good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Hai, and I'm research associate from ADBI. So thank you so much for, I have one question in macro. So to achieve the sustainable development, so many countries right now, like the monetary policy right now, many developing countries pursue like inflation targeting to achieve like price stability. So however, I found like Indonesia, Vietnam, or Philippines, the trade openness is quite high. So the exchange rate fluctuation may be even more important. So my concern is that should the central bank also react or respond to the trend in fluctuation in exchange rate in addition to inflation, because inflation targeting, they will put more weight on the inflation to achieve the price stability. So they maybe like put less weight on the other goals. So my question is that should they react to exchange rate as well? So thank you so much.
So your question is about whether the target should be inflation or exchange rate?
Or maybe they just put more weight on like exchange rate, especially for small and developing country like Indonesia.
Okay, okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So we have now 5 questions, and I'd like to ask each of you to answer some of or one question each, and 1 minute or 2 minutes, because we are now running out of time. So please go ahead.
Can I start? And I will address actually a couple of questions because they're related. First of all, on the fact that there will be a need for external capital, absolutely. Of course, it's a must, okay? But this cannot come alone, okay? What I'm talking about, growing out of poverty. That needs to be canceled, okay? So that these countries can survive. Risk, because this is always the impediment about investments. There are investment opportunities, but they are risky ones. Okay, the risk needs to be reduced by funds allocated by the North okay, to encourage investment in Africa, for instance, and not do it as a handout or something to support the poor, but rather as a compensation for the price that they are paying for unfairness. Okay? The same applies to your question about the geopolitical situation impeding development. Of course, they should not impede each other, but for this to happen, you need to have a fair system. Whether you're talking about G7, whether you're talking about G20, or you're talking about the UN, if it's a fair system that applies the rules to all, then you can have this kind of separation. And just as a very last word and a quick example, the IMF recently came up with a special program for Ukraine only, all right? This does not work. You need to have a system that applies to all and apply it for all. This is when you can separate political conflicts from development issues. But if you keep on tailor-making things to fit specific circumstances because they are interesting for you, then it doesn't fly.
Okay, thank you very much. Bamba-san.
Yeah, I like to respond about the inflation. So of course, central bank will put the inflation target as part of their main job by maintaining or making policy of interest rate. But then in the case of some countries that do not really that are not really affected by the high inflation happening in the mostly developed economy, is because not only central bank trying to maintain the inflation by, let's say, raising the interest rate a little bit, but the government intervention is very important. Government role in making sure, for example, the supply of staple food will be enough, kind of price management, especially at the consumer level, is also important. It has to be done by the government because central bank can only have one tool, which is the interest rate. That's why you can see some countries have to raise the interest rate very aggressively, like in US, but in the case, for example, in Indonesia or Vietnam, the interest rate is increasing, but not at the level comparable to the US, for example.
Okay, thank you very much. So,
yeah,
please.
Just 2 points. One is on the poverty piece, and in terms of the external funding, definitely there'll be a need for it, but I think the nature of how that's given will have to change significantly. You can't have node-driven models where you're being told in India or anywhere in South Asia, anywhere in Africa, how development needs to be done or how poverty needs to be eradicated. Also, looking at new instruments, even in the development sector, innovative financing mechanisms, it just doesn't need to be all grant funding. It could be blended finance. So I think we'll have to be much more creative in really seeing how at the end of the day we can really deliver on the SDGs. And I think the last point that I wanted to make was on the geopolitical side, and I know this morning as well, the G20 Sherpa brought that up, is the whole sustainable development goals. If we can really move the conversation around the SDGs, for which all countries have signed up, and we're really failing way behind, and we can keep getting geopolitical issues into all our conversations, but people, communities, the poor are getting more vulnerable and marginalized. I think that really has to be a conversation that we have to keep bringing up so that, we can really lift people out of poverty rather than, because things are just going to get even more dire. So I know it's hard, but again, it's really the need of the hour. And how can we really use the SDGs as a rallying point is really important, and start holding, everybody accountable. Those who've signed up for it, to really make that a reality is important.
Okay, Dilo-san, please.
Thank you for this interesting question. Actually, we have been trying to follow several farmers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. From the time we develop a technology, we roll out, and for many, many years we have been trying to follow. And we have found lots of disadoptions on the way. Not only that, it's very challenging for us to replace the technology. Farmers have been using the technology that they have been using for many, many years because they are very comfortable. So we have been trying to do lots of studies to see how we can replace those old technology with new, more productive technology. So these are the challenges we are facing. We can discuss more later, but the reason why they disadopt, as you say, is that they are yet to see the benefits. So I think one way to go is that you need to provide insurance to cover that gap during the periods when they are on trials. And second thing is that you don't give up, in the sense that you should continue with the demo plots, you should continue with the farmers' field visit, you should continue with what you call the trainings, and also involving female farmers, so that we continue to maintain until they see the benefits.
Okay, thank you very much. So please.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'll answer the question about political or geopolitical risks, since nobody has looked at that. I think that's a very important issue, and it's something that is a feature of macroeconomic research at the moment. I know that the current GFSR by the IMF looks at this particular issue. It's sort of well known that there are clear financial stability implications coming from heightened geopolitical risks. Of course, there are differences across countries in regards to how that impacts in terms of magnitude. But the important point to note from, I suppose, a welfare perspective is to the extent to which this would then spill over to output and spill over to consumption. And there's evidence to suggest that there are, material impacts on both output and consumption. So I think it's certainly something that the G7 should be monitoring from a macro-prudential perspective, as well as from a classic macro perspective. And I would expect further surveillance on this going forward, as well as its implications.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just want to make one comment about the geopolitics again. I'm an economist by training, and I have been thinking about many things from my economic perspective. And also Marxist said the economics is the foundations of a political system. So, but still, economic development can be supported by kind of a very peaceful, moderate policies. So geopolitics is now very important issues for Iran and others. Financial sanctions are often used, and also the economic securities and deterrence, and also technological war is now emerging. So how can we avoid it? And maybe we cannot totally solve the issues because countries have different ideas. So maybe we should manage it. And also, we shouldn't look at their history, identity, and national pride too much. We have so many different ways of looking at histories and identity. And if we adhere to that kind of ideas, paranoia, maybe people may feel that we must fight for our pride. But let's not do that, because we lose life, and it's not good for our economic development. And if we look at peoples are similar in a way. They look at the happiness of families and good food and so on. So we need this kind of friendship together with maybe balance of power or deterrence. It's too naive to say that we can disrupt the weapons, because other countries may have it. So deterrence may be unavoidable, but we should continue to have discussions. And this T7 and T20 and G20 and so on can be a base for that, instead of promoting further kind of a feeling of animosity. So, and also we can discuss many other issues from the eyes of G7, G20, and also the Global South. And this discussion was very comprehensive and, in a sense, touched many important issues. So, thank you for good discussion by panelists, and also good question by the audience and also listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.